You guys, what's the most arbitrary or capricious thing you've done lately? Yeah, it's an Administrative Procedure Act joke. You don't get a lot of those. James?
I threw out a lot of paperwork. I got rid of all the bills that had come in the mail. I just threw them away.
I don't know. I'm thinking of something baby related, but I think I'm very methodical and non-arbitrary in my
You don't want
new
to be
parenting.
arbitrary and capricious with your children. That is,
Yeah, they'll call you out.
eventually.
Yeah.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Ruth Marcus, a columnist at the Post, and this week we're talking about, yes, the Trump administration versus the rule of law. Over the past few weeks, the courts have started to thwart some of President Trump's boldest actions, like banning birthright citizenship and freezing all federal grants and loans. And a federal judge on Monday ruled that the White House has defied his order that federal funds need to keep flowing while the case is ongoing. And add to that the fact that over the weekend, Vice President J.D. Vance said judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. And it feels like we're in a real showdown between two of our branches of government. I am joined by two of my colleagues today to talk about the role of courts in today's political moment, and where the bounds of presidential authority may be extended or not.
I'm James Hohmann. I'm a member of the editorial board and a columnist.
I'm Jason Willick. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post.
It's great to be with you today, and I know it's hard for everybody to keep track of all the court cases that have sprung up. I think we're in the 40s and counting. So I'm wondering if we can talk about some of the main themes that you guys are seeing in these cases. And in particular, which do you most have your eyes on? Jason, you want to start first?
Well, I think a lot of the panic is overblown about these cases. I think we unfortunately have a government pattern now where the president issues a lot of executive orders, and some of them are within his authority and some of them are not within his authority. And then plaintiffs go to court to challenge them. Some of the challenges are premature, some of them aren't premature. A lot of them are forum shopped to favorable jurisdictions. But I sort of think this is going to be sorted out in the normal appellate process, which ones are legal and which ones are illegal. I haven't seen any evidence of defying court orders. So I'm mostly seeing, a very energetic executive branch and the normal process playing out against it.
Okay, Jason, that was, I can't wait to take you on this, but I'm going to give James his chance first.
Yeah, it's hard. There are more than 40 cases. It's hard to keep track. Trump clearly does want to project that he's taking aggressive, assertive, bold action. I do think he has strong grounds for appeal on some of the rulings, the temporary restraining order, for example, related to accessing Treasury payments. Others seem like a slam dunk against him, like birthright citizenship. The key is whether or not...
Wait, why I'm sorry to interrupt you, but tell me why you think that there's a lot of... he's got a great argument on the restraining order on the access to the Treasury.
I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, should be allowed access to Treasury databases. So should people that the executive wants to hire. It seems like something that is overreaching by the courts, and I anticipate that it'll be limited or rolled back on appeal. It feels like there's kind of this like move fast and break things approach. 8 years ago, obviously, there were a lot of judicial rulings against Trump's early actions. There were a lot of judicial rulings against Biden's early actions. This is normal. What matters is whether or not the president follows the rule of law, respects the courts. And, we saw on the TikTok case, Trump is he is defying a court order. I think that in some ways is one of the more troubling moves, whether you think TikTok should be banned or not. A law passed, the Supreme Court upheld it, and now Trump's not enforcing it. But a lot of the procedural fights don't exercise me quite as much.
So I'm going to disagree politely, I hope, with both of you and say that I think you're, and especially Jason, is underreacting here. I think, yes, all presidents in the modern world issue executive orders on their first day or early on in their presidencies. But this flood of executive orders is, in fact, unprecedented. The degree to which these executive orders affirmatively ignore, misstate, or order the ignoring of federal laws is also completely unprecedented. The degree to which the new administration has, we talked about two branches of Congress in the openers. We forgot about the third branch for an important reason, which is it seems to have forgotten about its own power. I'm talking about the congressional power to appropriate money. The shuttering of USAID, the now shuttering of the attempted shuttering of the CFPB is extraordinary. And I would, we'll see, James, how things play out with the DOGE incursion into the very sensitive Treasury Department data. But we have a process here normally where career employees who are carefully vetted and carefully trained and have security clearances that are properly obtained are the ones with access to this system. I'm not having that hard a time, I don't think, with a federal judge, even ex parte, saying, whoa, wait, there is potentially irreparable harm here, and let's just find out the facts. So
Yeah,
go ahead, Jason, because I have interrupted you so many times. You definitely can jump in.
Well, I think the DOGE, this case in New York regarding access to Treasury payments in DOGE is a perfect example of sort of what's going on. So if you read the complaint, they don't really know what's going on. No one totally understands what DOGE is doing. They say, we don't know what data DOGE is accessing. They're mostly citing media reports. So there's this panic, and this judge then gets a complaint at 9:30 p.m. from Democratic states attorneys general saying something is sketchy about DOGE, shut it down. And it's ex parte, meaning the government doesn't get to be heard. And a few hours later at 1 a.m., the judge issues an order that bans access to the Treasury payment systems to all political appointees. So only civil servants can see the payments, but the Treasury Secretary, Deputy Treasury Secretary, his chief of staff are denied access. And of course, the government says it's complying with this. We're complying with this, but that's crazy because you might need to be briefed on data from this payment system if you're a political appointee. It's not sustainable for them to be blocked. So I think, and then this causes over the weekend J.D. Vance to make this tweet and Elon Musk to say all sorts of absurd things. But I think this is a perfect example of sort of panic running to court before the facts are known, an overbroad injunction gets issued, and then people say a lot of ugly things about judicial review. But I think, it's not. This is all sort of abstract and foam.
Well, I'm gonna see your DOGE and raise you USAID, where the harm is not abstract, it's real and human and intense, where it's clear that they are refusing to spend funds that have been duly appropriated and then duly awarded, and where there is a really serious question about their behavior. But James raised the looming question, I think, which is, and you mentioned J.D. Vance's tweet. And so the question to both of you, and start this time with James, is, are we going to see the administration simply defy court orders, as one court says is already happening in terms of failing to comply with it?
I don't think so. I don't think we're at a constitutional crisis yet. Obviously, I know a lot of well-credentialed people disagree with me, but it does seem like the administration is making its case in the courts. It is appealing. The Supreme Court is going to be receptive to their arguments. I do worry that the politicians are working the refs. A switch in time saved 9 was what they said in the 30s when FDR tried to pack the courts, and all of a sudden the Supreme Court started being more amenable to his programs. I do worry that there is some bullying of the courts happening.
What do you think JD Vance was up to with that tweet?
He's been laying the groundwork for this for years now. He did this podcast in 2021 where he recalled the very likely apocryphal quote from Andrew Jackson about let the court enforce its order. But he's been talking about ignoring court orders in the context of basically getting rid of the civil service, making sure that everyone in the government is loyal to the president. I mean, I think they want to have this, they want to look constrained. They want to be able to have scapegoats when they don't achieve their agenda. And I think there's a risk for Democrats that they look like they're fighting to defend an ossified status quo that most Americans feel like isn't delivering for them.
Wait, so you're saying they want to look constrained, so J.D. Vance raised the prospect of ignoring a court order?
I think it's reckless. No, I think it is. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I just think that I think Vance is agitating for a fight.
I think Vance and other Republicans, Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, called this judge in New York an outlaw judge. I think a lot of this, again, is overheated rhetoric. I think the judge gave them this opportunity by issuing an overbroad injunction, and judges should be careful to not panic and in the middle of the night issue overbroad injunctions because that's going to lead to this kind of rhetoric and this kind of debate, even when the underlying processes are working fine.
Oh, well, are they working fine?
If you look at the details, they're debating the scope of a restraining order. The judge has blocked spending pursuant to one memo. They're debating whether that covers spending that's blocked pursuant to another memo. And, they're complying with it and appealing it. So I still see that as a good faith legal negotiation, not defiance in the sense of, you're an Obama appointed judge. We're not going to follow what you say.
I'm curious about whether, though, there is defiance to come and whether, because it seems to me that J.D. Vance, before, during, and after various political campaigns, has been signaling this for years, and it certainly feels to me like it's in keeping with President Trump's instincts. And so, are we on the verge of a constitutional crisis, or is that blowing it out of proportion? And if the president does say, this court order, I don't see it that way, I'm not going to follow it, let them enforce it, what happens then? James?
Well, then it is a constitutional crisis. If you actually have Trump defying something where it's not a good faith negotiation, I think there are clearly some areas where the Trump people want to fight it out in court to expand the power of the presidency. Impoundment is a big one. Impoundment puts you on a much more dangerous trajectory where you essentially are marginalizing and taking away Congress's constitutional power of the purse, the ability to control how money is spent. Obviously, the fight that Jason was mentioning is related to the spending freeze, but Russ Vought, who has now been confirmed to run the Office of Management and Budget, has very explicitly said that he thinks the Impoundment Act that passed in the wake of Watergate is unconstitutional and that Congress can't force the executive branch to spend all the money that it appropriates. I am certain that's going to go to the Supreme Court. And I think that the Trump administration is happy to fight it out in the courts because they think that they can probably ultimately win. I disagree with them. I think the Impoundment Act is completely constitutional, but they have a different view of executive power and Article 2 than I do.
So I would like the record to reflect, please, that James Hohmann went wonky before I did and started citing specific statutes. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. This is not it sounds like a really technical and boring fight about budgets. It is that, but it is also a really important fundamental point about the separation of powers and about the power assigned to Congress that is the most important, which is its power of the purse to determine where federal taxpayer dollars get spent. And if that is taken away from it because the president claims that he alone has the authority to determine whether or not to spend this money, then we have seriously undermined the separation of powers. And that sets the stage in some ways for a double constitutional crisis, which is the constitutional crisis of the president defying Congress. And then if it were to come to that, and we'll see, the constitutional crisis of the president defying a court order on that. And so now that I've hyperventilated, I want to ask Jason a question about whether I'm going to, this is your chance to say you're going too far and you need to settle down, because you've warned Democrats and the media, me, not to go hyperventilating over every executive order. And I'm wondering, are there any of these Trump moves, either executive orders or other actions, that you think warrant really going kind of nuclear over?
I'll start by saying, I mean, you talked about J.D. Vance. I do think there's a spectrum of lawyers in this administration between traditional constitutional conservatives and people like probably Russell Vogt is a better example at the OMB, who are sort of do take a more willful and a view of executive power that's outside of the traditional conservative view. And I think it's going to be a tug of war a little bit between them. But I also think there's quite a reverence for the Supreme Court among a lot of these lawyers who are working in the Trump administration, and I would be very surprised if those lawyers are going to tell the Supreme Court to go pound sand. And so on the power of the purse, I mean, it's important to remember the biggest and most important Supreme Court case on that last term was when President Biden claimed that he had the power not to stop spending money, but to take money and forgive student loans, hundreds of billions of dollars. And that was a 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court against him. I think you're going to see this court also fairly, police Trump's incursions into Congress's power of the purse too. It's a problem. Where the problem arises is Congress often passes laws that give the executive some discretion over how to appropriate funds, or, you have this much money, give grants to who you want, or, spend up to this much money. And the Trump people are being very aggressive about trying to find places where they can direct the money as they please. And it's going to be a question of, well, what did Congress actually say? And Ruth, I think, to me, the most alarming thing Trump has done so far is something that's totally legal, which is pardon the violent offenders on January 6th. Sometimes the president can do things that are totally legal, that are alarming, and sometimes he can do things that you don't like that are legal. Of the executive orders, I think the birthright citizenship one is likely wrong. It was, blocked immediately. I think the latest thing that he's done with NIH funding to try to stop the overhead is also very likely exceeds his power, stopped immediately. So I do think, a good portion of these executive orders exceed his power, but that alone can't be a cause for alarm if they're duly being, if the process is playing out and they're duly being adjudicated.
On this note of potential agreement, that might be an excellent time to take a break. But we'll talk more in a bit about whether the Supreme Court is going to have its hands full with cases about Trump executive orders. Spoiler alert, yes. But first, our break. Welcome back. I'm Ruth Marcus, and I'm here with James Hohmann and Jason Willick talking about the court cases against Trump, and that is cases plural. Do you guys think part of Trump's strategy here is that he can try whatever he wants, and if it gets challenged, the Supreme Court, with a conservative majority that includes 3 justices he named to the court, is going to take his side? Is he banking on that, or is there something else going on?
I think he's banking on it. I assume his lawyers are telling him that not everything is going to survive legal challenges, but that he made these promises on the campaign trail and he wants to keep them. But I definitely assume that Trump is counting on the conservative court to take his side more often than not. And I'm sure he was emboldened by the immunity decision that the court issued last July.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say this on that point. If you were trying to win at the Supreme Court on like some really important issue, like let's say the firing of inspectors general at departments, you might, put that out there as your test case. The flooding the zone both the way they're talking, which I'm sure the Supreme Court is noticing, this aggressive way that they're talking, and the way that they're flooding the zone with challenges rather than sort of setting up the perfect test case for a specific constitutional rule that they want to be changed. They're sort of taking the view of like, justices, we're going to dump this on your lap, see what you do with it, not taking the most delicate approach that you might expect to try to get the court to decide your way on a given issue. You also, by the way, if you wanted the Supreme Court to look favorably on your White House and your Justice Department, you wouldn't try to appoint Matt Gaetz to run the Justice Department. So there's definitely a sense like, we're going to win. When it comes to it, these justices are going to rule in our favor most of the time, or if they don't, we're going to blast them for it. But they're not sort of making it easy for John Roberts and some of the more moderate justices to rule in their favor.
So I think this is a really important point, Jason, that people haven't talked about enough, which is that if your specific goal were to win as much presidential power as you can in court, you might go about this entirely differently than if your goal were a bunch of different things at once. Because if their goal is to flood the zone and impress their allies and, even more important, unnerve the opposition, they're doing a great job. But at the same time, as Jason suggests, they're unnerving federal judges who do not necessarily get easily unnerved, but once they are annoyed and unnerved, have a lot of power over you. They would act more slowly. They would pick their cases more carefully to be the best ones, the most troubling inspector general, or the most out of control congressional limitation on removal power, or the most upsetting federal agency, instead of, this fire hose of actions. I do think that, and this is where I'm going to be different than you might expect. I am strangely optimistic about where the court is going to come down in terms of a couple of really important attempts to expand presidential power. I think on the congressional spending power, aka impoundment, this court, if it is true to what its members have said in the past, is going to say, read the Constitution. This is a congressional power. Among the people who have talked about the primacy of Congress in determining spending are William Rehnquist, no longer on the court, but a pretty well-known conservative Chief Justice, Antonin Scalia, no longer on the court, but same, John Roberts as a young lawyer in the Reagan administration, Brett Kavanaugh as a younger judge on the appeals court. There is a lot of writing correctly that they have done that suggests there's going to be some hostility to this really quite breathtaking of assertion of presidential power to determine spending. Similarly, with birthright citizenship, it is hard to count up anywhere close to a majority of votes on birthright citizenship. And then I think there's other areas where things are more up for grabs, or things are going to go more in the administration's direction. Its power to remove sort of senior officials, because this is a court that doesn't like the idea of independent agencies and may have enough members gunning for them that the headless fourth branch of government will no longer be the fourth branch of government, but moved back within the executive branch, which all the presidential imperialists think it will be. But I do think if we look back on this in a year or two, we will say, boy, if they had gone a little slower, they might have gotten a little bit of a better result.
I mean, I definitely think they will feel that way. And when you talk to lawyers, even inside the government, they marvel that a lot of the orders that have been issued are pretty sloppy and are hastily drafted. And they obviously had a lot more ready to go this time than they did the first time. But I've heard from numerous lawyers who are sort of unimpressed with some of the legal work product. That said, I think Trump feels like he tried to do it the other way the first time. Obviously, those of us who lived through 2017 remember the weekend of the Muslim ban and the travel ban and all the drama. But I think Trump's view is, I tried to work within the system the first time. I'm not going to do that the second time. I also think people around Trump recognize that he's going to become a lame duck sooner than later because he can't run for a third term. And so there is this desire
So we think.
So we think. But he's not going to. And there's a recognition that they have to move fast and break a lot and that they don't have time to tee up test cases because they have a relatively short window to govern and a relatively tiny majority in the House. So they've got to just throw everything against the wall and hope that some of it, even if they know not all of it, but that some of it will stick.
And I would just say, when the dust settles, we'll find out more about whose funding is cut and whose isn't. I mean, if you read the filings now, it's like totally unclear what has been restored, what has not been restored, what they're trying to restrict. And that's, a product of this fire hose approach. But the courts work best when you have a very clear factual record and you have, somebody saying this funding was cut this time. And, the courts can come in weeks later with a full understanding of what happened and craft a remedy. Right now, we sort of have these vague orders that we don't even know what they mean by reviewing all funding related to the president's executive orders. And hopefully that the issues can be narrowed before this gets in an emergency posture to the Supreme Court, like, are the Trump White House's executive orders okay? And hopefully we get drilled down, because I've been frustrated at the lack of specificity in a lot of these debates.
But I guess I wonder, Jason, you talk about the ultimate remedy, but I wonder whether the immediate damage isn't the point. In other words, yes, let these things percolate through courts, and maybe the orders will be specific about what should be restored, and maybe they won't be, or maybe they won't adequately be on that, on firings, on all sorts of things. Are we just trying to break a lot of stuff quickly so that by the time the court processes catch up with it, the damage is already going to be done?
I think that there can be, remedies. I mean, Biden, I forget how long it took from when he issued his student loan forgiveness to the Supreme Court case around it. I think on something like USAID, no matter what, under a Trump administration, USAID is going to look different, even if he overstepped in some of the ways that he's cutting it down. But a Democratic administration will be able to.
Shutting it down. I mean.
Well, that's really overstated. I mean, if you read the documents, they're talking about we need 600 employees to perform the statutorily required mission of USAID. We don't need thousands. We need 600. That's not shutting it down. That's a small. I think what they're saying is we can do the legally required functions with a smaller agency. And I think a Democratic president, if it turns out,
the agency that is supposed to be a separate and independent agency into the State Department in violation of the congressionally enacted statute.
We'll see how this plays out. I don't read it that way.
Right.
It says that the USAID is under the direct authority of the Secretary of State. I mean, look, but
that's
you have
not
a
what
point.
The law says. I think that I respectfully disagree with that. It says it's a separate entity. And there have been a lot of debate about whether it should remain a separate entity that I think Congress settled. But
a separate entity under the direct authority and supervision of the Secretary of State, who has now been appointed acting director according to the legal process by which you appoint an acting director.
I'm going to give James the last word here.
Some of it really depends on how committed Donald Trump is to reducing the size of government. Obviously, that is not something that has really motivated him before. I think there are people like Russ Vought, who's running the budget office, who is very committed to the ideological project of slimming down government. For Trump, I think his main interest is getting revenge and going after the people who he thinks undercut him during his first term, who prosecuted or as he sees it persecuted him during his time in the wilderness. Going after USAID is low-hanging fruit, regardless of the legality. But Trump really, I don't think, has an appetite for taking on entitlement programs or the biggest drivers of the debt. And so the question is, once he sort of gets his pound of flesh and shows that he's being smash-mouthed and taking on the so-called deep state, does he sort of move on, or does he really actually try to cut into the bone and live with the political backlash, which, if it was, Medicare and Social Security, is going to be a lot stronger than if it's some foreign aid programs that don't directly affect most Americans.
Good point. And with that, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you, Jason and James, for joining me on Impromptu this week.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Demir Marusik, Chris Sulentrop, and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you think about what's going on in the courts right now. Send an email to impromptu@washpost.com. And if you're liking the show, please be sure to leave us a rating on your favorite podcast app.